we'll go ahead and open the session.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so welcome to New Perspectives, an integral yoga platform that is sponsored by Aro University in Surat, India, as well as the Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Centers in Surat and here in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. And all three organizations are founded by H.P. Rama. And I'm Reddy. I'm the executive director of the Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Fountain Inn. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko, who is also our moderator for today's webinar. So today we are very honored to have with us Dr. Ananda Reddy, who will speak on a special topic called Record of Yoga and Savitri, the Inner Link. Many of Sri Aurobindo's explorations and experiments during the early days of his intense sadhana are noted in his record of yoga and later collated in Savitri at appropriate places. So during this New Perspective webinar, Dr. Reddy will share with us links discovered between the two recordings. Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko will now introduce Dr. Ananda Reddy and open our New Perspective forum. Vladimir.
Thank you, Radha. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Ananda Reddy, who is a founder and a director of SAKAR, Sri Aurobindo Center for Advanced Research in Pondicherry, where I had a privilege to study under his guidance, and I completed my PhD there. Ananda grew up in the ashram under the guidance of the mother from his early age. His father, Madhusudan Reddy, was an ashramite and a great scholar, as we know. We read many of his books, and one of these is very famous, his trilogy on Vedic Epiphany, and many more writings. So today's topic is a very special and to a certain extent new. And I'm looking forward to hear what Ananda Reddy is going to say to us, because that would be of great interest to all those who study Sri Aurobindo. The relation between the record of yoga of Sri Aurobindo's diary, actually, and his major work, Savitri. So without further ado, let me invite Ananda Reddy to address the audience. Please, Ananda.
Well, namaste to all. Good evening for the Indian audience and good morning on your side, the American audience. Well, whatever the time, I think we are going to have a little bit of chat on record of yoga and Savitri, their inner link. But it's a very interesting topic indeed. But I must tell you right at the outset that this comparison itself was initiated and inspired by Richard Hartz, a very profound scholar from Sri Aurobindo Archives, Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Pondicherry. I happen to have read his articles in Mother India long many years back. But that's what started off my interest also. Because that showed really what the mother has been always telling us, that everything that Sri Aurobindo wrote is from his own deep personal experience. So of course we know about Savitri, as mothers told us, that every day he used to have these experiences. But while thinking of that, I really wanted to bring to you, in brief, very short analogy of some important ideas. Because, in this given time, we can't do too much. So what I discovered was two things. Savitri has been subtitled, as all of us know, a legend and a symbol. Savitri as a legend and Savitri as a symbol are represented by two astounding verses. They are, respectively, this day returning, Satyavan must die. And the second one, forever love, O beautiful slave of God. It is as if the whole of Savitri as a legend hangs on the single verse which was prophesied by Narada. We first hear this prophecy as the last line of Book 1, Canto 1, which, as someone very beautifully discovered, is the 365th line of Canto 1. And we know very well what it means. It is after 365 days after Narada's announcing that Satyavan will die. So what does Narada tell you? This was the day when Satyavan must die. That was the last line of Canto 1. And then you see the rest of the books and cantos seem to be a kind of a flashback until we hear this prophecy once again in the proper context. Narada declares, after listening to what Savitri had to tell about Satyavan, after a long discussion, Narada declares, 12 swift winged months are given to him and her. This day returning, Satyavan must die. And Savitri declares her decision. Once my heart chose and chooses not again. Then from there, this flashback of the legend ends in Book 6, and then the present struggle of Savitri begins and continues to the death of Satyavan in the forest, Book 10. Then begins Savitri, the symbol. Though I must hasten to add that it would be an error to divide the epic so very categorically. Although the whole of Savitri is steeped in symbolism, right from the first line, it was the hour before the gods awake. The climax, the most powerful and symbolic line is obviously, forever love, O beautiful slave of God. Well, I got to choose this line, again based on the mother's declaration. The mother said, this line gave me the most overpowering experience of the entire book. I read it again. This line, forever love, O beautiful slave of God, gave me the most overpowering experience of the entire book. Because, as I told you, as I read, I would live the experiences. Reading brought instantly a living experience. And when I came to this particular line, I was as if suddenly swept up and engulfed in eternal truth. Everything was abolished except this. So obviously, we have here now two lines. This was the day when Satyavan must die. That is the central line for Savitri as a legend. The second one, Savitri as a symbol, we have this line, as we said, forever love, etc. And this is given by the mother herself. So I was confident that we were on the right track. And now what we see further is that both these verses, these prophetic and symbolic verses, are based purely on Sri Aurobindo's personal experiences during the days of his intense tapasya from 1910 to 1914 and a little bit to 1920. After 14, the recordings are lesser. experiences that were noted down and later published as record of yoga. There are, and surely there must be, other verses that link record of yoga and Savitri. But I'm going to look deeper into these two amazing verses, trying to establish the inalienable link between the two records, record of yoga and record of a seeing, that is Savitri. It's very interesting, both are called records. And that also gave me a little more hint to put them together. Sri Aurobindo himself writes that the earlier version of Savitri that he had written in Baroda was more a legend and not a symbol. You see, there is already a kind of a discrimination between legend and a symbol. Again, he takes it up around 1926-27. It is then that the second version turns into a symbol, and that too the most magnificent symbol that the world of literature has ever seen. He seems to have poured in the version of 1935 his deepest and highest consciousness, for he had climbed by then the first stages of the supramental consciousness. He wrote, "Now I got the hang of the whole hang thing. Like a very Einstein, I have got the mathematical formula of the whole affair, unintelligible, as in his case, to anybody but myself. And I'm working it out figure by figure. The tail of the supermind is descending, descending, descending. It is only the tail at present, but where the tail can pass, the rest will follow." Now, this is where we see now my basic introductory ideas about these two parts, if I can say, the legend and the symbol, and described by these two verses. And then further we see that these two verses are both a record. And when we start thinking in these lines, what comes to our help is the mother's own summary of this entire Savitri. In one of the notes published in Champaglaul Speaks, we see mother's notes on 4 different aspects of Savitri. Again, she uses the same word. Savitri is the daily record of the spiritual experiences of the individual who has written. Again, you see the word daily record. A complete system of yoga which can serve as a guide for those who want to follow the integral sadhana. Third, the yoga of the earth in its ascension towards the divine. Fourth, the experiences of the Divine Mother in her effort to adapt herself to the body she has taken and the ignorance and the falsity of the earth upon which she has incarnated. Amazingly, what we see here is that there are 4 levels in Savitri. That is on the individual level, the collective level, the earth level, and the level of the avatar. So it's a magnificent book which has been dealt on 4 different levels. So it is useful for the individual sadhana, collective sadhana, the earth sadhana, and the sadhana of the avatar himself or herself. But what is relevant to us at present is the first aspect, namely the daily record of the spiritual experiences of the individual who has written it. Indeed, Savitri is the record of a seeing of the experiences which impacted Sri Aurobindo's consciousness both on the physical and psychological levels. Sri Aurobindo expresses in a letter of his daily experiences. We know well what is the difference between a subjective experience and a dynamic, outward-going and realizing force. So although we have faith, and whoever did anything great in the world without having faith in his mission or the truth at work behind him, we do not found ourselves on faith alone. but on a great ground of knowledge, which we have been developing and testing all our lives. I think I can say that I've been testing day and night for years upon years, more scrupulously than any scientist, his theory or his method on the physical plane. Well, all these that I'm putting together as quotations from Mother and Master only tell us one thing, that all these experiences that have been collected during his days of tapasya have somewhere been embedded in his own consciousness. What we see is that from this years 1910 to 1914, he has intense tapasya, or what we say later on we'll understand what he calls the new path, the Sapta Chatushtaya. That's the path he discovered himself. Although we do know that Swami Vivekananda came in the prison in Alipur jail and gave him a kind of a direction toward the supermind, although he doesn't utter the word supermind himself. Swami Vivekananda still told him a few steps on the way, maybe some lampposts. But here, coming to Pondicherry, he discovered the Sapta Chatushtaya, or the seven tetrads. And here, what he has been telling about like a scientist testing day in and out, and day in and day out, and noting them, and these notations are published later as record of yoga. Now, what is interesting is, although the period when he was maintaining his diary does not coincide with the period of his writing Savitri, because we know 1910 to 1914 is the diary, and Savitri is somewhere between 1920 to 25, first time, and the real thing comes in 1935 onwards. So, it is important to note that while he was engaged with his inner journey and noting down his progress on the different parts of his being, he was also pouring out in the area, like a cascade, his spiritual knowledge gathered until then, as well as his knowledge acquired from his yoga sadhana during the period of 1910 and 10 to 14. That's why it has been emphasized by the Mother that all he wrote in his several books is based on his personal experience. So what I'm trying to bring to your note, I'm sure you understand. There's a long gap between the sadhana and then the taking up of Savitri in its final state. But what does it mean? The last entry of his record of yoga, was 31st October 1927. Whereas he revised his earlier versions of Savitri, written in 1926-27, almost 8 years later, in 1935. In fact, I'm indebted to Richard Hartz again, for he has done a wonderful study to see how they have been brought together. That means the record of yoga and Savitri, verse, canto by canto. Mr. Richard notes that the three main chapters of Ashrapati's yoga, the yoga of the king, the book of the traveler of the worlds, and the book of yoga, which consists of Ashrapati's yoga and ascent, and which is recognized to be Sri Aurobindo's own personal yoga, were written after 1927, when the documentation of the record of yoga was stopped. So you see, these three main chapters of Ashrapati's yoga, they come after the record of yoga. So that shows quite clearly that the experiences that were really fresh in his mind during the record of yoga have been transferred to Savitri. And also, very interestingly, even the book of yoga, which continues the main journey of yoga of Savitri towards the discovery of the soul, comes long after the period of the record of yoga. In such a situation, how did Sri Aurobindo put them together? On the deeper level, the issue of correlating both these records can be resolved by interpreting the daily record on two levels. One, many experiences that Savitri had gained, many experiences that Sri Aurobindo had gained during the years of his noting down in the record of yoga were carried over to Savitri in whichever year it was written, revised, or edited. Secondly, Savitri contains largely those ongoing experiences during his ascent of consciousness. So if we see deeper into Savitri, we will see both parallelly, both these experiences. One is what we say experience of tapasya, and the other is his own ascent of consciousness. Now, what we are will try and do it is that how do we collate? It's easy to claim that these experiences of his intense tapasya are brought into Savitri, but do you have a proof of that? That's where again Richard Hart gives us a beautiful kind of a hint. In fact, a couple of very good studies also has done. So I'm going to take up only two examples, because these are the two examples that suit my own example of the Savitri as a legend, represented by the word, by the sentence, this day returning Satyavan must die. And of course, the one is called Trikala Drishti, and the other one is Dasya Bhava, which suits very well the second sentence of forever love, O beautiful slave of God. So I'm going to stick to those two lines which I've highlighted in the beginning, and then show how these two lines, which are one of the primordial verses in Savitri, are really based on his experiences of record of yoga. So that really links us Savitri and record of yoga. Now, what does it mean? Trikala Drishti? It is very easy, very commonly known. There is a special faculty of jnana by which that general power is applied to the actuality of things, the details of event, tendency, etc., in the past, present, and future of the world as it exists, has existed, and will exist in time. So it is the knowledge of the three phases of time, past, present, and future, of the individual, of the collective, of the world itself. Now this has been, by our ancient Indian yogis, it has been experienced, experimented with, and conquered, this Siddhi. But of course, if we get into the details of that, it's very, very interesting how Sri Aurobindo experimented with little ants and birds and all that, not in order to gain power of the ant or the bird. It is more an experiment to see, can he predict the next movement of the ant or the squirrel or something? It may seem very small. You may see what's big about, guessing about the movement of an ant. But it's not very small for Sri Aurobindo. Because these experiments on ants are brought in again in Savitri too. He says more or less the same sentence, that he has seen the movement of the ants. It is not exact lines, surely. But you see how even the smallest experiment on the ant is brought in later. If it is 1914 and 1936, after 20 years or so, the same example of ant is brought into Savitri too. But here, as I said, I'm going to focus only on these two verses which I pointed out in the beginning. Now, Trikala Drishti is really closely related to Narada's prophecy. This day returning Satyavan must die. So what does it imply? That Savitri is the future time on the level of the present manifested time. Narada prophesies not only the fate of Savitri, Satyavan. Please remember this. So when it says Satyavan must die, so it's telling us something about the fate of Satyavan that's going to happen. So it is the time future. And then time future of the individual, but at the same time, he also foresees the future of Savitri herself, and Savitri, and obviously the world linked with her. Here are the lines. A day may come when she must stand unhelped on a dangerous brink of the world's doom and hers, carrying the world's future on her lonely breast, carrying the human hope in a heart-left soul to conquer or fail on a last desperate verge, alone with death and close to extinction's edge. Well, it's a great prophecy uttered by Narada. But this prophecy, I personally feel, is not Narada's. Sri Aurobindo has used Narada as a character to give this prophecy, which truly does not belong to the level of Narada. We'll see later on why. Narada is in fact known as a divine sage, Manas Putra of Brahma, who is equipped with Trikala Drishti. He can see the past and connect the future to the present. That has been our Indian tradition when we speak of Narada. Sorry. He has foreknowledge, but he uses the foreknowledge to forewarn those protagonists in the event or in the story or in the lifeline. So he knows the future, but brings it to the present, to the knowledge of the people around him, only to hasten the future, what we say, the catalyst of the future. Narada is the catalyst of the future. He reveals only that much of his foresight as is required for the immediate future. Sri Aurobindo says in one of the lines, he hid in his all-knowing mind the rest. So see, it only shows us that Narada knows much more than what he has said. But he doesn't tell that, because that's not useful for the present event. Or maybe by hiding some of the truth of the future, it's better to see that the present rolls on. So Sri Aurobindo says, he hid in his all-knowing mind the rest. This I feel somehow as a strong feeling is Sri Aurobindo speaking about himself. And then through Narada, Sri Aurobindo expresses his own experience of Trikala Drishti. Sri Aurobindo writes, O deathless sage, who knowest all things here, but still, that who knowest all things is not Narada. It is Sri Aurobindo himself. In a way, the whole of Savitri is a record of Sri Aurobindo's own Trikala Drishti. So one little Siddhi can be applied to the entire Savitri. But that Savitri, as the mother herself emphasizes, it has the past of the earth, the way it was born, its mission, and its future. So we can see there's a little distinction between Narada and Sri Aurobindo. Although Narada tells a few things, I feel it is Sri Aurobindo himself who's telling through the mouth of Narada. Now, why am I distinguishing these two, Narada and Sri Aurobindo? Because Sri Aurobindo speaks of two types of Trikala Drishti. He calls one the passive and the other one the dynamic. I mean, Sri Aurobindo is so great, so beautiful, so clear. That's why I often said nobody can explain Sri Aurobindo except Sri Aurobindo himself. That's, of course, if you have the patience to go through the different writings. So he says there are two kinds of Trikala Drishti, the passive and the dynamic. Narada represents the passive aspect, meaning that he can see the future as time, but is not given to change or know what is beyond time future. Well, I will see the next one and then tell you. the dynamic Trikala Drishti can see beyond the normal time-future sequences. It takes into account the forces that act and intervene from beyond the spheres of earth consciousness, from transcendental realms. So you have got it? The passive one is a horizontal time-future. The dynamic one is the vertical future. Vertical in the sense it takes into account all the forces. Because you see, in this world, it's not just one force or one devil and one evil. There are forces, good and bad, on different levels. Occult levels, spiritual levels, physical levels, subtle physical levels. So this transcendental time vision, it takes into account all these forces, whereas the passive one takes into account only the horizontal level. So here we have actually, normally we have an example here. Normally the yogacharyas and our religions have taught us that all that is born must die one day. It's the truth of the physical world. The death of Satyavan foretold by Narada belongs to this lower hemisphere, to the passive Trikala Drishti. That means this truth that is there on the physical level, the horizontal level, and Narada is a passive Trikala Drishti. So you could see Satyavan only going to the extent of this, after 12 months, this man, Satyavan, is going to die. But what happens after that and beyond that is not given to see. And here, there's a simple answer, explanation, that why is it that Narada does not have the capacity to see the beyond the time future? Because he does not have that vision, that time future, that beyond time future, which is contained only in the supramental consciousness. So Narada, at best, represents the over-mental knowledge, over-mental Godheads, over-mental consciousness, which can see a lot of things. But beyond is not in his capacity. And it's here that we see Savitri as this example of one who can see beyond the time frame, because she is the representative of the supramental consciousness. So she has a supracosmic will and a power of intervention, because it's only the supramental consciousness that can have this power of intervention through all the layers of the occult, the physical, the vital, the mental, and everything. And this kind of intervention over mental Godheads do not have. So Narada could not tell us what would happen to Satyavan. Whereas here we see Savitri as a wonderful example. Her single will opposed the cosmic rule. Her single will opposed the cosmic rule. To stay the wheels of doom, his greatness rose. So right from the beginning we see that here is a person, here is a character who has come with this ability of a supramental consciousness and will and power. That is why Sri Aurobindo writes, her single will oppose the cosmic rule. Who can oppose the cosmic rule? It's only one who is transcendental, one who is beyond the cosmic powers. And who can stay the wheels of doom is only a transcendental power. So this is a character, Savitri, who is beyond the horizontal level, and that's why she alone can cancel doom and death that are predetermined on the frontiers of time by her unchanging will. She comes to annul the decree of pain and death, to erase the formulas of the ignorance. So it's a very clear distinction here. Savitri is not just a personality, a strong person with a divine consciousness, but she is a strong personality with, to begin with, even a supramental consciousness. Because it's only because of that Sri Aurobindo has described it, and with all these things, that she can oppose the wheels of, she can stay the wheels of doom, she can oppose the cosmic rule, etc. It's not Savitri per se, it is Savitri, the supramental incarnation. And then what we see here is that Sri Aurobindo, about Sri Aurobindo, the mother has said, this Savitri is wonderful. He foresaw everything, says the mother, saw everything, absolutely everything. There isn't one point he left unexplored. So all these characters, Savitri or Narada or Satyavan, anybody, they're different aspects of Sri Aurobindo's own consciousness, obviously. So we see Sri Aurobindo's supramental consciousness in Savitri. And then ultimately about Trikala Drishti, we have a third level. That is, on a higher symbolic level, death and Savitri represent these two aspects of Trikala Drishti, time future and beyond time future. We see an example here. Death says, touch not the seated lines, the ancient laws. Respect the calm of great established things. This is exactly what happens on the horizontal level. That you respect what all has been happening in the tradition, in the past, nothing to change. Whereas Savitri says, Savitri is born to change the destiny of the earth, so she refutes, saying, I trample on thy law with living feet, for to arise in freedom I was born. So right from the beginning, she has the courage, she has the will to oppose death and say, I trample upon thy laws. And this indeed formed the crux of the debate between death and Savitri, one representing the eternal law of horizontal time and the other vertical time which can intervene, cancel, remold fate, doom, and death. Apart from this, apart from the faculty of Trikala Drishti, Sri Aurobindo had acquired many more siddhis which got later reflected in Savitri. But it's not our present intention to go through all the seven Chatushtaya, namely Shanti, Shakti, Vijnana, Sharira, Karma, Brahma, and Sansiddhi. It would surely be a good research if one were to analyze how all these or most of these Saptachatushtaya have been woven in Savitri. Well, when I was writing this, I said, my God, that would have been such a great work, such a great research, great or good in sense, that somebody should attempt. What I would really thank again and again Richard. He has initiated a very beautiful movement. A scholar should come forward to see how much of Sri Aurobindo's earlier sadhana is embedded in Savitri. And maybe our understanding gets richer. But now I'll come to the second Siddhi, Dasya Bhava. And the line that we quoted was, of course, of forever love, a beautiful slave of God. This Dasya Bhava is also a Siddhi that Sri Aurobindo acquired. And Dasya is an important experience of the three pillars of integral yoga, that of surrender. Or the Dasya Bhava, the other two being aspiration and rejection. Dasya, the term is used in the record of yoga to denote a state of complete submission or of being a slave. You see, one of the things that we don't understand in this line, that is, oh beautiful slave of God. You see, that's the word that really is the key word. Forever love, we can still understand. Of course, we don't understand. We'll see what the mother says. But still, we think we understand. That's what I can put it. But when we say the slave of God, we are unable to understand, put together this question of slave and servant and God together. Here is a beautiful explanation by the mother and by Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo tells us in the synthesis of yoga, remember I'm connecting from 1910 to 14, and we jump to again to 1914 when Sri Aurobindo starts writing his Arya books. In the synthesis of yoga, he says, Dasya means submission to that which is beyond us, enabling the full and free working of its power. A little later, in the essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo says, Dasya or Dasyam denotes the service of God in the world, of which the controlling power is the divinity within us, in whom we are one self with the universe and its creatures. A little longer passage somewhere, again, the essays on the Gita. It's not merely a passive submission. He's explaining the Dasya aspect. It's not merely a passive submission, but an active self-giving, not only a seeing and an accepting of the divine will in all things, but a giving up of one's own will to be the instrument of the master of works. And this, not with the lesser idea of being a servant of God, but eventually, at least, of such a complete renunciation both of the consciousness and the works to Him, that our being becomes one with His being, and the impersonalized nature only an instrument and nothing else. Well, I'm going to put together these ideas once again in a simpler form. So we see here, I'll just take a quote from Mother and then come back to it. Again, in Savitri, so these have been written early during the yoga times and during the Arya time. It was still in between 1914, 16, 18. But when Savitri is taken up, again after 35, 36, what do we have? Again the same line. Forever love, O beautiful slave of God, about which the Mother has said again something. I've read one part in the earlier time, in the earlier passage. Second time we hear the Mother explaining in a different way. You see, Mother is telling. You see, Mahalakshmi is the Divine Mother's aspect of love, the perfection of manifested love, which must come before the supreme love, which is beyond the manifestation and the non-manifestation can be expressed. The supreme love referred to in Savitri, when the Supreme sends Savitri to the earth, forever love, O beautiful slave of God. So now we are coming closer to the two phases. One is the slave, O beautiful love, forever love. So what is this love? It is, as the Mother says, is the beyond, which is beyond the manifestation and non-manifestation, the supreme love. So we have the love of the Mahalakshmi, the perfection of manifested love. Mother explained that lover of Mahalakshmi must first be established on earth and in men and human beings. And then only the supreme love can manifest. And so the Mother is telling, this word love, forever love, denotes that supreme love. So Sri Aurobindo, or the Supreme Mother, is invoking to that supreme love to manifest. So it's not just the human love or the divine love or the God's love. It's the love beyond the manifestation and the non-manifestation. So Mother has again, the second time, referred to this wonderful line. And here she explains what is the true source of love. And now we get back to this question of the Dasya bhava, the Dasya. There are two levels of Dasya bhava, because that's what we have seen. What's the meaning of Dasya, the servant or the slave? How do we surrender? So we see there are two levels. First one is the level of surrender, and is that of the servant. Dasya literally comes as a servant. It says surrender also is done by servant, but the servant has a relationship with the master of obedience. Let us concentrate on that. Dasya on the lower level is a servant. But what is the relation between the servant and the master? It is that of absolute, complete obedience. And this is the general understanding. Sri Aurobindo writes in the Synthesis of Yoga, obedience is the sign of the servant. So when we look at it from a spiritual angle, it implies an absolute obedience to the master, to the guru. That is why in the Guru Shishya Parampara, there is the need of an implicit obedience to the guru. So this is what has been practiced for ages in India. So when we take somebody as our guru, we do not question. There's no question of argument, disbelief. It is in that manner as the Shishya becomes a Dasya. There's an absolute surrender, but still there's a question of a servant, a slave, and obedience. Then there's a second level of the Dasya Bhava. It is that we do not obey, but move to his will as a string replies to the finger of the musician. To be the instrument is the higher stage of the self-surrender and submission. Here comes the real word. Second level of Dasya Bhava is to be the instrument. First lower level is the slave, the servant. Second is the instrument. To be the instrument is the higher stage of self-surrender and submission. What does it mean again? But this is the living and loving instrument. I hope you have noted this question there, shown the sentence. The instrument is like the string replies to the fingers of the musician. There's a relationship between the musician's finger and the string. That is the innate responsibility of the response, not the responsibility, but the response. So the master and the instrument is not the servant who is waiting to see what the master wants him to do. There's no question of waiting. This instrument knows innately what exactly the master wants. So there is this relationship of Sri Aurobindo writes here. This is the living and loving instrument, and it ends in the whole nature of our being becoming the slave of God. This is again from the synthesis. So here he explains that this loving instrument ends in the whole nature of our being becoming the slave of God, rejoicing in his position and its own blissful subjection to the divine grasp and mastery. With a passionate delight, it does all he wills it to do without questioning, and bears all he would have it bear, because what it bears is the burden of the beloved being. So here we understand very beautifully, as again and again say, the master alone who can himself explain. Otherwise, we couldn't have ever understood why Sri Aurobindo used this beautiful word, O slave of God. So this slave is the beginning. But then this slave turns into the instrument where he responds automatically, spontaneously to the will of the beloved. And then this spontaneity is itself turned into a kind of a slave of God, because for him there's no greater delight than to be responding to him automatically. So note that this quote is from Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga, written sometimes in 1918 and 19. But it again appears in 1935, 37, 38, whenever it was about Savitri. So what does it imply? Obviously, this bhava was so important to his yoga. Sri Aurobindo gives it the highest place in Savitri. Forever love, O beautiful slave of God. So you see, this throws a lot of light on Sri Aurobindo's own yoga. As we have been telling many a time by now, that the synthesis of yoga is nothing but his own yoga, practiced more or less during those years of tapasya. So you see, that dasya bhava which he realized during tapasya has been brought into essays on the Gita, on synthesis of yoga, because time and again he's repeating that, and to the extent that he brings it again after about 20 years once again into Savitri, and gives a line which the mother says is the most profound and the most powerful line in the entire Savitri. She says the entire book. So that really made me to think the power of the single line. And surrendering to the divine never means that one has to lose one's individuality. It means only entering into a great delight of being, which is so tender and full of sweetness that Sri Aurobindo calls it Dasya Bhava and Madhura Bhava. This again, I'm indebted to Richard, the way he has linked Dasya Bhava with Madhura Bhava. In this Bhava, one has the experience of the delightful sweetness and joy in the service of the divine. And here, to kind of exemplify this Dasya Bhava and Madhura Bhava, we have beautiful, brilliant lines. This is in book 11. Who hunts and seizes me, my captive grows. This shalt thou henceforth learn from thy heartbeats. Forever love, O beautiful slave of God. O lasso of my rapture's widening noose, become my cord of universal love. And they are reverberating with such a power and a vibration. And then imagine what the context in which this line comes, forever love, has almost made a beautiful, I won't say the word beautiful is itself too small a word. I mean, it's something beyond, we cannot express, at least I cannot. The way the Supreme Mother has been telling about her new creation and about a relation with Savitri, and then very powerful, and while I'm reading this, I remember the Mother's own reading of this. Nobody can imitate what the way she has read it. I mean, obviously, she alone can read this because there are her own lines. Who hunts and seizes me, my captive grows. You see, it's a paradoxical thing. You see, when the hunter is hunting an animal, he doesn't become its captive. Somebody goes and kills a lion or something. He hunts it and conquers it. But with the divine, it's so different. You hunt the divine, you hunt him, you seize him, then what is the reward? You become the captive of the divine. My captive grows. This shalt thou henceforth learn from thy heartbeats. So then she's addressing Savitri, forever love, O beautiful slave of God. And then a wonderful line again, O lasso of my rapture's widening noose. She's calling Savitri the lasso of the divine. What's the function of a lasso? It goes around somebody's neck, the heart, the being, and pulls that person towards himself or herself. And so the Divine Mother is asking Savitri to become the lasso of her widening noose, so that this cord of the lasso can be the cord of universal love, that means drawing this humanity towards the divine. And what powerful, what vision, these beautiful lines. So the poet says that if one truly hunts and seizes the divine, one becomes his captive, his slave. The paradoxical situation is that the more one possesses the divine, the more one becomes his slave, meaning that the divine possesses him evermore. Now the last section, of course, we have seen how these two verses, which are really so primary to Savitri, are really embedded in this yoga, the tapasya and the record of yoga. So if somebody were to choose which are the best lines, well, now we know which are the best lines. One chosen by the mother herself, and then one from the point of view of the legend. The whole thing is, this day returning, Satyavan must die. The whole story that connects with Mahabharata, that connects with the present Savitri. So these are the two lines which we can always remember. And this is the question brings in about surrender and slave and, instrument and all that. But always, as usual, the mother has the last word. Mother would say, beyond surrender, there's something more. Beyond the dasya bhava, there's something more, something greater, something higher. And that something higher is called self-annulment. Here is what the mother herself says in one of her experiences. It was like this gesture of self-abandonment, the total, complete self-annulment, annulment of what, of that which we can know. Annulment of that which can know, of that which tried to know. Even surrender isn't an adequate word. This is the catch sentence. Even surrender isn't an adequate word. It's a sort of annulment. And suddenly it ended with a slight movement as a child could have, who doesn't know anything, doesn't try to know anything, doesn't understand anything, but who abandons himself. A light movement of such simplicity, such ingenuousness, such extraordinary sweetness. Words can't express it. Nothing, just this gesture of self-abandon. And instantaneously the certitude, not expressed, lived. The lived certitude. I mean, it's not easy to explain this. But somebody, the mother alone, can really take you to that higher level beyond being a slave or instrument or even surrendering at a low level. When she says this experience of self-annulment is beyond the question of surrender. Because even this question of surrender or instrument or slave or whatever we say, there is a kind of a separateness. You are surrendering, you are becoming an instrument. Of course, you as an instrument ultimately become a kind of a slave of God because you are merging yourself, there's no self-will, there's absolute surrender, etc. But still this experience of the mother, where she says it's like a movement is so simple, it's like a child could have, who doesn't know anything. See, this image is so beautiful. The child who doesn't know anything, doesn't try to know anything, doesn't understand anything, but abandons himself. I mean, you see little children of 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. I mean, they are just given up physically, mentally, everything. They don't know, they don't expect nothing. So that, she says, is an experience superior or beyond that of surrender. In fact, when I read this from the mother, it's the same experience, if some of you remember who have read this, that the mother had when she met Sri Aurobindo for the first time on 29th of March 1914. There are long, many descriptions. I have chosen one from Nalikanta Gupta. And I've chosen this, of course, there is the report by K.D. Setsna and others. But Nalita writes something beautiful, which is very close to what the mother has described here. He writes, when the mother came here, she gave herself to the Lord, up to the Lord, Sri Aurobindo, with the candid simplicity of a child, same image. After erasing from herself all her past, all her spiritual attainment, all the riches of her consciousness, like a newborn babe. This is the same experience of self-annulment. She felt she possessed nothing. She was to learn everything right from the start, as if she had known or heard about nothing. See, this kind of absolute self-annulment, Sri Aurobindo later on appreciates, is only she who could have done that. And then obviously, she was not just an ordinary she. She was herself that Savitri, the supramental manifestation, who in her own tapasya, in her own prayers and meditations, as we come to know, had already achieved a kind of a supramental consciousness, had achieved a universal consciousness, had brought down the universal force to save the earth. So here was one who had given up all that achievement. Imagine not just a bit of a knowledge or some conquest of a Siddhi or something. But that was the Supreme who alone could do this kind of a self-annulment. And then when she says, the mother herself says, when I first met Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry, I was in deep concentration, seeing things in the supermind, things that were to be, but which were somehow not manifesting. I told Sri Aurobindo that I'd seen and asked him if they would manifest. He simply said, yes. And immediately I saw that supramental had touched the earth and was beginning to be realized. This was the first time I had witnessed the power to make real what is true. You see, when we spoke about the certitude, that this self-annulment brought in, as the mother says, a lived certitude. This is exactly the lived certitude that she got from Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo didn't explain anything. He simply said yes. And immediately, the certitude, the vision, so her mind was descending. So the yes of Sri Aurobindo implies, when all thy work in human time is done, the mind of earth shall be a home of light. The life of earth, a tree growing towards heaven, the body of earth, a tabernacle of God. Awakened from the mortal's ignorance, men shall be lit with the eternal's ray, and the glory of my sun lift in their thoughts, and feel in their hearts the sweetness of my love, and in their acts my power's miraculous drive. My will shall be the meaning of their days, living for me, by me, in me, they shall live.
Thank you. Thank you, Ananda. You left us speechless. There are some questions, if you would like to answer. They are related to the whole talk. First is from some anonymous attendee. Sri Aurobindo took legend of Savitri to such epic proportions. What could have initiated Sri Aurobindo to select the legend of Savitri?
What could have, or can I repeat the question?
Yes, what could have? What could have initiated Sri Aurobindo to select the legend of Savitri?
Well, there are a couple of things we should understand. You see, it is not. See, from two different angles, we have to look at this question. One is an epic. Some of the established norms of writing an epic is this, that one should connect it with one's own cultural past. Otherwise, it becomes a hairy-fairy imagination. So it must have some kind of a cultural roots. This has been the epic tradition from all over the world. There is one's own culture or some other culture, but it must have a human past. And most of these epic writers have connected with their own cultural roots. So that Sri Aurobindo had the advantage of taking this story from Mahabharata. So that gives us a kind of a past which is known, which is common to most of the Indians. So Sri Aurobindo had this advantage that he could not have taken from anywhere else this background, which had already satisfied one of the conditions of writing an epic. Secondly, this was one of the themes that were really in his mind for decades together. Prior to writing the Savitri, he has written other poems also with the same theme of love and death, like Ruru and Priyamvada. So the other tales, but in the other tales, the conditions of death are different. In fact, life compromises with death. But here is a story, love conquers death. And of course, as I said, epic proportions because it's linked with his own epic aspirations. What is that epic aspiration of Sri Aurobindo? To transform the physical, to immortalize the mortal, to divinize the earth. So these aspirations, these ambitions, this vision itself is epical. So obviously, he brought in a theme which matched his own aspirations. Because this Mahabharata story gives us this conquest of death. But how it is conquered, there's a different story level, there's on ethical level, religious level, moral level. But the central line of the conquest of death was what attracted Sri Aurobindo to take up this story. So, in brief, one on the literature level, the other on the spiritual level. So, and then obviously, the third level was his own personal experience. His experiences were massive. Spiritual experiences, outer experiences, experience of the world, experience of different people. I mean, apparently he was working for India's freedom. Apparently he was doing this thing. Apparently he was doing all that. But what massive experience he had gathered. And which single book would have contained his absolute massive experiences of spiritual, vital, local worlds, divine worlds, of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, of the Gita. So unless and until he wrote a massive epic, he couldn't have pushed in all. I don't know even if in Savitri they pushed into it everything that he had experienced. But surely we see that this contains his entire, whatever we know, his entire spiritual past. So, and then his aspirations were fulfilled. They transformed earth. And then the mother really tells us, now we understand why Savitri is a message. All his other writings were only a kind of a preparation. So all the other major works of Mother, of the Life Divine, Synthesis, Essays on the Gita, whatever you name, they did not contain Sri Aurobindo's entire spiritual, massive, epical experiences. They could not. The theme was limited. Even the Life Divine was limited, although it has his philosophy and his aspirations, but these experiences could not be translated into the book, The Life Divine. So that is why ultimately, you see, the earlier times when Sri Aurobindo was writing Savitri also, it was more like a legend, he himself says. It was more a legend. That only means that it could not contain all his experience. So later on, he took it up again in 1935, and as I read out in my talk, by then he had already started pulling down the Superman by its tail. So he had added the last dimension or last level of his experience, and therefore he rewrites the second version or the last version, wherein his supramental vision, his supramental contact could be brought in. So that was kind of the whole embracive experience of himself, of the earth, of the divine, etc. So I do not think that there could be any other version of Sri Aurobindo except Savitri which would justify his vastness of experiences and what he wanted to give to the world. And it's only Savitri which with its mantric effect alone could withstand the depth of his vision. You see, for such a vision, prose cannot help. Prose doesn't have the power. The innovative power it doesn't have. The invocative power it doesn't have. So Sri Aurobindo had to take to Savitri the verse form, the verses, the poetic form. So there are many of these things that we have to look into when we say, why did Sri Aurobindo take up this epic work in Savitri? On all levels, it is, as the mother says, it's the message that's given to the world. And it's really the transforming power. It may not be now for us. Only a few could realize perhaps. But it is left to the world, to the earth, the future humanity. You know, it's like a wave. Sri Aurobindo has touched the wave of the divine consciousness, released it to the world. As a mother in her experience of 1956, she tells us that she saw a huge golden door and she gave him one big hammer blow and then the supramental started coming down. She released that supramental consciousness and force. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo too has released through his Savitri this magnificent supramental consciousness. And it will now reach out into the world slowly and steadily and conquering the human nature, transforming. It will take a long time. But so was it when Sri Krishna came with his mental force, mental consciousness. So friends, I'm sorry, there's so much to say about Savitri and to answer you, but I've given you a couple of angles to look at.
Thank you, Ananda. Actually, you answered all the rest of the questions in your answer to this one. I can add from my side to this question why Savitri was chosen as this legend from the story. If there are so many stories, why not other story? And I noticed myself when I studied Sanskrit and we read for the first time original Savitri in the university, and I was shocked from one particular thing, that Savitri, it is the only story of Savitri and Satyavan in the whole epic, actually in the whole Mahabharata and Ramayana and everything else we know from Puranas, where the prediction, which is the Satyavan must die, was undone. Epic story is built on this. First the prediction, then you see how it happens. It must happen. Once the prediction is there, you just see it unfolding. In this case, I'm looking how it will finish, how it will unfold, and I come to the result. It is undone. It is changed. It's the only story in the epics, and most probably that's why Sri Aurobindo chose it for his own epics.
Interesting.
That's what in my talk today also I said, this is the beginning, the first prophecy which comes on the 365th line of Savitri,
Right.
that if they're returning, it must be Satyavan must die. So the prophecy is given. And then rest of 6 books or so is only nothing but a kind of a flashback of this prophecy, how it's going to be worked out. So there is that logic also is there, what you have just now described, that how it's going to be undone, we are taken to the climax. And also on the physical level, it is done. You see, the beauty is that here come the different levels of destiny. As you said, Narada's prophecy on the physical level, but Savitri's work on the supramental level. So it's a mixture of done and not done, must die and has not died, did not die. So that is again the philosophy of the truth, the total truth. We think that destiny is only on one line, on one level. But here is what Mother and Sri Aurobindo are telling us. What has happened on the physical level, what Narada said, it is done. But there's beyond Narada, there are other forces, that's Savitri's force, which Narada knew about it. Narada also knows her truth, but he did not reveal. But that is the beauty of Savitri, that it encompasses the truths of the physical and the supraphysical truths and prophecies. Thank you, Narada, Vladimir. giving at that angle.
Right. The similar topic was discussed with Sri Aurobindo, where he was asked also why your prediction did not happen. You remember most probably. And he said that in that moment, that force which changed the situation was not there. So the decision of the Lord can come anytime and undo any circumstances. So it doesn't have to be fixed in the particular form forever. It's just a field in which things and forces are manifested. So it's another view. It's more from the Purushottama point of view. As
That's what we said, no? That Trikala Drishti has two levels. One of the passive and the other the dynamic.
Absolutely.
The
As you
level
described it.
Yeah. Narada has the passive level. But one who can intervene is the dynamic Savitri. So that is what you're saying. This is what is given as Savitri. The intervening power is there. And that was what is again depicted in Savitri.
And do you think most probably even the Lord of Death, in that case, in Savitri, is more horizontal kind of argument? He's a sophist and very wise man, but on a horizontal level.
Exactly.
Not on the vertical. He doesn't understand that there can be change, really.
Yeah. So that is why Sri Aurobindo, I think toward the end only we see the intervening Savitri coming down. I mean, when she takes upon herself her own supreme form. So that's the intervention. And as Sri Aurobindo himself says, that intervening force can really undo things on the cosmic level. So that's where Narada had given the word, she can undo the things. So what all we are talking about is really very beautifully applied to Savitri.
There is one more question here which mentions Markandeya, and I must tell before I address it to you that Markandeya's story is also very closely related to the story of Savitri, first of all, because it is Markandeya who in Mahabharata tells this story to Yudhishthira, actually, who asked him the question, was there a lady who suffered so much as Draupadi in this world? And he says, and Markandeya, you know who is Markandeya? This is the eternal, immortal being from the first Kalpa, ever young, 16 years old Rishi, now tells the story, and he says, yes, there was Savitri. And this is very ancient story, he says him in Mahabharata. If it is ancient story for Markandeya, we can imagine, who lives already for several manvantaras. So they are related in a way. Markandeya, Savitri, and the myth of immortality.
That's why you see, everything comes so beautifully. That immortality, Markandeya is telling, who is himself an immortal, talking about Savitri. I mean, it's one beautiful theme of immortality.
Yes.
Thank you, Vladimir.
Thank you, Anand. It was a real great pleasure, and it was a deep insight into the truth of Trikala Drishti, of the horizontal and vertical understanding of time, which is actually very well put and very well expressed. Thank you very much. And we hope to have maybe second round with you on Savitri.
Because I'm interested in discovering something new, it's not just once again repeat what many scholars have done. But I take the fun of the delight to really discover some new angle, a little new point, one small spark maybe. But once I get that spark with an intuition, and then my mind takes over to logically put it together. But if I get some such inspiration, I'll come back to you. I'll share with you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And if you would like Dr. Reddy to make any announcements about your Savitri program that's coming up, please do.
Yeah. Maybe I can take the opportunity.
To talk some sure.
From Sakar, we have decided to bring up a program for celebrating Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary. We have been doing this from January of this year. That is, we have invited 3 scholars to speak on one single book of Sri Aurobindo, one major work. So we have covered till now 3 speakers speaking on the life divine, synthesis of yoga, Savitri, human cycle. And then till the end of June, we'll be covering 2 more books. But from August onwards, we are celebrating Sri Aurobindo's, right from August 15th, talks on Savitri. There will be, we have invited about 24 speakers, all different themes, but all based on Savitri. Because Sri Aurobindo's greatest work is Savitri, so we wanted to offer ourselves to Sri Aurobindo through Savitri. And some of the names of the speakers are known. Maybe I do not know many. In fact, I don't know so many. I'd be happy if you could send your name and if you could send your theme, because these will be pre-recorded talks, so that any time that suits us, there shouldn't be any clash between the speaker and the timings and all that, and especially when the timings change, vary from the West to India. So we thought of pre-recording it and then streaming these talks at a time that is convenient to both the Western world and the Eastern world. So friends, I invite all of you, anybody who would like to take up a topic on Savitri, but purely based on Savitri. I'm sure you would have read it a couple of times, having to have some kind of a study, because these are going to be international talks. So they must have some kind of a degree of maturity of standard. It's not just a kind of somebody saying, I want to talk. Yeah, these we'll be inviting the abstracts of from each speaker. And once I see the abstract is really of a good standard, maybe then we'll send an acceptance letter and then an invitation letter. So maybe Vladimir or Radhe, they have my email, they have my WhatsApp, and I'll be very happy if some of you could participate in this celebration of Sri Aurobindo's 150th anniversary. So let's all unite, come together in Savitri, because Savitri alone, I'm sure, can bring humanity together. Well, transforming humanity, as the mother says, will happen. Let's begin by offering our love, our devotion, our dedication to the Lord through Savitri. I invite everyone, or those who would like to participate in that. Thank you so much, Radhe and Vladimir. And through you, I reach to all of you who are lovers of Savitri. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That sounds absolutely fantastic. A wonderful set of events. And we would just also like to announce that Aro University and Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Centers are also beginning a series of upcoming events in the same dedication to the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo. And these events are designed to really help better understand Sri Aurobindo's contribution to the future of mankind in all fields, whether it be social sciences, philosophy, psychology, culture, or poetry. And the first will be on May 1st, Saturday, and the event is going to feature discussions, films, and interviews on Sri Aurobindo's literary contribution to art, poetry, and drama. And every 3 or 4 months, we will come out with a second, third, fourth series. But registration is open to all, absolutely no charge. And later this afternoon, you all will be receiving an email announcement. So we hope you all can join us, and we hope you also can join Dr. Reddy's Savitri series. Thank you.
This is the same thing we are going to do. Ours is also on YouTube. It will be free, no registration. So I invite all the participants or listeners, come and join us and make this celebration a unified effort. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Namaste.
Box, very few box.